Welcome back to the Modjeska School for Human Rights. Tonight, we're going to do something a little bit different. What we're really wanting from everyone is a lot of participation. Tonight is, in some ways, almost an open forum for us to think about what we learned last week about the intersections of democracy and capitalism, and then take those lessons from last week and use them to think about what's happened in the last not just 2 weeks, but the last couple of months in terms of the relationship between our political system, between that and capitalism, and then between both of those with race and healthcare. These are all topics that have come up a great deal in the last few months. Thinking about things like the fact that COVID-19, which if you watch news reports, it seems to have been almost forgotten about now, but the COVID-19 epidemic or pandemic is still raging on. In fact, just today, numbers in South Carolina indicate it's actually getting worse. The numbers have gotten worse every single day for the last few days, and it does not appear to be abating anytime soon. Of course, with COVID-19, we've talked a lot about disparities in healthcare, disparities in just quality of life between various racial and ethnic groups in the United States. And you add to that, in the last 2 weeks, we've had a lot of discussion about the utility of voting in terms of making a difference versus other forms of demonstrating, other forms of political organizing and political agitation. Now, all of these elements have become incredibly urgent. I think what's the sad irony about our class is that while these are all topics we'd be discussing in a normal Modjeska School class, it seems that this particular session, all of these topics have taken on a much greater sense of urgency in ways that in January of this year, I certainly could not have imagined. 2020 is a year that has proven how so many of these lessons are incredibly important for us to learn, recognize, and hold on to. So tonight, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of these ideas, but I don't want to do a whole lot of talking. I really want to make this more of an open forum discussion. All of you received the email from Brett earlier about some of the themes we want to talk about this evening. And actually, one thing I did want to start off with is, well, let's be blunt about it, thinking about the political utility of riots. Because I think that's important to talk about this evening. Before I do that, Brett, did you have anything you wanted to say when we get started this evening?
Robert, just that it is really a provocative time where the idea that we built the Modjeska School on, and the notion that I've been working for 50 years since I was a young revolutionary, is that we don't have in this country the cohesive power and force and discipline to take control. Military action is out. That's the suicide mission. Lenin called it infantile, left-wing infantile communism, adventurism. And that the work that we have to do is old-time organizing. It's the type of work that Gandhi did in mobilizing millions of Indians to be able to throw the British out. It's the work that people that were involved in looking at the 1968 struggles in Palestine were wishing that the Palestinian liberation movement wasn't trying to shoot it out with Israel and the Great Satan, because you know, they got the guns, they got the money, and that they would have won much more hearts and minds, many more hearts and minds, with a more grassroots, broad-based, nonviolent movement. I think that's where we are. Now, I'm not against self-defense. I've always been somebody that if somebody's coming after, you know, my dog or my cat, I'm going to fight him. And that, but politically, collectively, we can't make a collective change that has staying power without having the people on our side. And so that's the idea of popular movement building. And that what we have to do is to prepare ourselves to take advantage of opportunities to move the ball. Now, let's see, what kind of opportunity did I think about? Oh, a global pandemic and a totally insane clown running the United States of America. It's like, damn. And so I'm at a point of like going, Well, I guess we just kind of watch and figure what happens, because I've seen these peaks and valleys of awareness before. I mean, I was in Washington, D.C. on May Day, 1970. Or was that 71? I can't remember. If you were there, you can't remember. When, if the government won't stop the war, the people will stop the government. There were 10,000 people arrested that day. And I was already underground. They were already looking for me. And so I couldn't get arrested, but I was like running with, people that were getting arrested. And we woke up at dawn with people nudging us, sleeping around the reflection pool. And we looked up, and there was a wall of DC cops in black with helmets and shields, with motor scooters and horses. And they started moving the crowd. And right up at the Washington Monument, you can see it. Great big Sikorsky troop transport helicopters with the 82nd Airborne leaping off with M16s. This is my country, right or wrong, right? And so we've been here, and they go back to another decade, and they're lynching people. And so this fact that we've seen this before, what do you do? And the reason we can't sustain it is because people don't remember, because they erase our history. And so what we're trying to do with the Modjeska School, and God bless all the young people, and Avery's joined us, and you'll get to meet Avery later. I put the Kool-Aid in Avery's glass this weekend. But the idea is to be able to make something sustainable that makes sense to people, and you've got to show them something that works. And so when you're fighting a fight, you damn well better have a win plan in there. You may lose one target, but you're building a movement. And so that's what I'm talking about. Taking advantage of opportunities, listening to all the people that are speaking at the events. We were just talking before we turned the recording on, is that in Colombia, everything I'm hearing from that's coming across the media, at least, from the leaders of the protest and from all the politicians and the civic leaders that are talking, is register and vote, and it will make the difference. That's what we've got to do. And those of us that are paying attention know that that is the hopes that they want us to be victims of, because they'll just wash, rinse, and repeat their old cycle. So I want to thank everybody for being here. I'm going to shut up now. And is Todd joined us?
I don't think he's joined us quite yet.
Okay, he said he'd pop in. Todd Shaw is actually our political scientist in waiting, and there's periods of our Modjeska School where Todd, who's one of our adjunct faculty people, this is his specialty, but he said he would come in. And so Robert, I'm going to turn it back to you to facilitate the dialogue and discussion.
Okay, so I want to start off tonight's conversation. I want to read a couple of quotes. One, I'll just read the quote first, and then I'll tell you where it's from, because it actually ties into the multiple conversations we're having across the country about a number of different topics. And the quote is, quote, "And as we walk, we must make the pledge that we shall always march ahead. We cannot turn back. There are those who are asking the devotees of civil rights, when will you be satisfied? We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality." Now, that particular line actually comes from one of the many sections of Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech that a lot of people seem to gloss over and forget about. With the I Have a Dream speech, we always quote the exact same section every single time, but it's a much longer speech than those few lines. And I illustrate that because the problem of police brutality and the problem of the relationship between race and crime and punishment in American history has a very long history. You can find quotes from people as important as W.B. Du Bois way back in the 1910s and 20s talking about police brutality. You can find photographs of marchers and demonstrations against police violence in places like Harlem and Detroit in the 1930s and 1940s. This is to illustrate that police brutality is not a new issue. And in fact, many activists, many intellectuals and so forth in the 20th century have noted how if you look at any so-called race riot in the 20th century, whether you're talking about Watts in 1965, Detroit in 1943, again 1967, or Augusta, Georgia in 1970, or LA in 1992, or Miami in 1980, all those riots have one thing in common. They were all sparked by some sort of problem with police brutality. They had been building up for months, if not years, and there's a particular incident that sparks a massive conflagration. Now, I give that brief rundown because, as with everything else we've talked about in the Modjeska School this particular session, a lot of the issues we're wrestling with in 2020 have long and often painful histories. And I think that's important to recognize, because what it tells us is that we are not operating within a historical vacuum. As Brett pointed out earlier this evening, the importance is to recognize that these histories are often not told to us for specific reasons. Because if you don't have the tools to know that, well, this has happened before, this is how folks have dealt with it before, then it becomes more and more difficult to create strategies in the here and now. Things to think about that will help us with this particular problem. Now, I mentioned Dr. King at the start of my conversation this evening. I want to read you guys one last King quote, because this is another one I've heard floating around a lot. Now, for any of you who watched the news, read newspapers recently, or gone online and read about the riots in Minneapolis, in Seattle, all across the country, you've probably seen a lot of the dialogue about the political importance and utility of riots. Now, all of this ties back to the questions Brett posed in the email that he's posed again in the comments that I want to really get to tonight, because that'll be the bulk of our discussion. But everyone, again, has quoted Dr. King as saying that a riot is the language of the unheard. Now, the thing about historical figures and historical writings is that you need to take everything in context. And with Dr. King's statement, a riot is the language of the unheard, you really should view that in a particular context of when it was given. I'm going to very briefly share my screen, and then want to get to the questions we have for this evening's docket, because I think this is an important lesson to recognize. Because King recognized that violence in the short term and the long term doesn't go very far in actually solving the issues you're trying to deal with. Because he recognized that utility and that intersection of capitalism, of racism, and imperialism, and how all those things interact. And I think, of course, we would also add the problems of sexism and homophobia as well. But I want to very briefly share the screen here. And this is me putting on my professor hat and using primary sources to kind of get my point across here. If you go online and look up that actual quote, "A riot is the language of the unheard," you'll eventually find the context in which that line was given. If you look, this is on the Grosse Pointe Historical Society's page. It was where Dr. King gave a speech about civil and human rights on March 14th, 1968. Note the date. That's only a few weeks before he's assassinated. But what he says in this speech, if you read on here, is he talks about how he has that line. He says, "And I must say that tonight that a riot is the language of the unheard." But if you go a few lines before that, he points out that riots long-term are a bit dangerous to count on. He says, quote, "I am absolutely convinced that a riot merely intensifies the fears of the white community while relieving the guilt. And I feel that we must always work with an effective, powerful weapon and method that brings about tangible results. But it is not enough for me to stand before you tonight and condemn riots. It would be morally irresponsible for me to do that without, at the same time, condemning the contingent, intolerable conditions that exist in our society. These conditions are the things that cause individuals to feel that they have no other alternative than to engage in violent rebellions to get attention." And as he goes on the note, he talks about the plight of the Negro poor in particular, that he argues is at the heart of many of these riots. And you want to keep in mind, again, when he's talking about this in March 1968, King is already putting together his Poor People's Campaign. He's already trying to cobble together a coalition of Black Americans, Latino Americans, Native Americans, poor whites, people from all across the country who he's trying to rally together to really come to Washington, D.C. And this was his last campaign. His idea was come to Washington, D.C. to enact a massive act of nonviolent civil disobedience that would literally shut the nation's capital down. and to demand that Congress finally and forcefully deal with the myriad of problems facing poor Americans all across the United States. Now, that was King's way of trying to bring together the issues that we're talking about this evening, the issues of capitalism, of militarism, and also the problems of capitalism and democracy, how these things intersect. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing the screen, but I will send out the link to that speech right now. And what I want to do now, just getting us started off tonight, because again, the questions that Brett has posed tonight and the questions that that Todd Shaw and Lewis Pitts dealt with last week about capitalism, democracy, and so forth, these are theoretical frameworks we really need to think through. Because if you don't deal with the problems of capitalism and what we call democracy in America and how they tie together with the struggles we're talking about on the ground here in South Carolina, then it's difficult to really imagine the kind of change that has to happen. All right, so any questions as we're getting underway, or any comments in particular, thinking about free market economics? And I think the first question we want to start with tonight is the free market economy that currently sets the budget priorities of our state and nation able to pivot to address current popular demands? We're seeing this play out in major cities across the country right now because people are beginning to realize, oh, our teachers are having to pay out of pocket for staplers and paper and crayons and markers for the classroom, partly because our city budgets are so massively geared towards the police and giving the police a wide range of gadgets and such to be used against citizens. It's been said time and again, a budget is a statement of your moral values. So let's think about this. How does a free market economy, do you think that can actually be used to address our current demands right now, or what you're hearing in the streets about police brutality on the one hand and about COVID-19 on the other?
No. The quick answer is no. I think one question, a philosophical question that we can answer is, is there, you hear the description democratic socialism. Is it possible to have democratic capitalism? I'm of the opinion that it doesn't work that way. The two are not compatible. But so the idea of trying to change things right now within the same system, free market, indicates that, well, let's see who's got the money to, bring about any change. So the same inequality, the same maldistribution that exists now will dictate the outcome of anything that happens within the system that exists right now.
No, I think that's a really good point. Again, you're exactly right, Rick, that this idea of democratic capitalism, I think, is an interesting idea. And in fact, there is actually a term for that I've heard thrown around in the last 5 years called social capitalism, which it's a relatively new theory, or it's one that hasn't been promulgated that much. It's this idea, and I'll put it in the chat room because there's a link to social capital and what this means. There's this idea that some social scientists are arguing for that, well, okay, capitalism, just naked, unfettered capitalism, that's not what we want. Okay, most of us can agree that that's a bad thing, although the last 30 years of American history seem to show that actually a lot of people are saying that's okay, but whatever. What some social scientists and scholars are beginning to argue is that if you can construct an idea of social capitalism, this idea that you can find a way to harness the best of capitalism. And actually, let me share my screen again, because I want to share the story with all of you guys. If you think about, because this is on their website, social capitalism that they're talking about, it is defined as a socially minded form of capitalism, where the goal is making social improvements rather than focusing on accumulating capital in the classic capitalist sense. It is utilitarian form of capitalism with a social purpose. And then you look right above that, and I think somewhere I can hear Daniel Dewey's teeth already grinding, because it says social capitalism is related or associated with the third way, the humanization of capitalism, democratic capitalism, and social democracy. But again, I think back to Rick's point, right? If the people in power, people who hold the levers of power, where this money comes from, where this money is used through, flows through, it's like social capitalism or democratic capitalism is basically contingent on these people basically saying, we're going to not act like we've acted like for the last 200 years of history as the folks who are in charge of heavy industry and commerce, etc. Brett, I see you have unmuted yourself.
I wanted to contribute another definition to the social capital being kinder, gentler capitalist, and we'll call that liberals, and we'll call that neoliberals, and we'll call that people, well, Henry Ford, who wanted to pay his workers enough they could buy his car. Generally, when human beings run things, they've got more sense than when corporations that are completely detached from reality run things. And so as the generations of the robber barons that built America, the great industrial power it was, and the great imperialist power it was, the thing has been turned over to Wharton MBAs, third generation people, that there's no humanity left. And what we studied back in the day of study groups in the 70s was the deindustrialization of America. I mean, there was a time when America had industry, and then there was a time when the money was more concerned about making money than it was making steel. And so we could make steel cheaper in Japan. We could make computer parts cheaper in, China. And so we deindustrialized America for profit. And so I don't know that we're going to be able to have a kinder, gentler capitalism where capital isn't the predicate of set.
Well, last fall, didn't a group of 100 major CEOs get together, and Jamie Dimon issued a statement on how they're going to change the way they do business rather than shareholder value? It's going to be social value, and they're going to run their corporations for the good of everybody. And some people, I said, oh, well, you got to give them a chance. You got to listen to that. It was a short-lived PR campaign. It didn't go anywhere, but they came right out and said that oh, we're not going to do this just for shareholder value, which has been the dominant philosophy since the 80s. They said, oh, well, we're going to do it for the good of society. Well, by their definition, they are society.
I think, and to your point, Rick, there's that famous quote of what's good for General Motors is good for America. And I think what we're dealing with here with the ideas behind, can you achieve this kind of progress in a free market system? This has often hindered movements over time as well. So one example that comes to mind for me is thinking about at the tail end of the civil rights movement in the late 1960s and the rise of Black Power. You also had this concurrent rise of what was called Black capitalism. This idea that African Americans, if they own their own businesses, if they invested in their own communities and try to play within the rules of the capitalist system, that might be one way to deliver. But the thing about Black capitalism is that activists at the time argued over what that meant. If that meant simple fealty to capitalism in general, or if it was closer to
Robert, I don't know if you know that we're not hearing you. You've been frozen in time, or you have a computer problem. He's going to get through to us.
I hear him.
I hear.
I hear him.
I hear.
He's back.
No, he never left.
He never left.
That's
Keep going,
you,
Brett.
So, that's thanks for the NSA for messing up our call. But anyway, I kid, or do I? Anyway, back to Black capitalism. But the idea behind Black capitalism, in some ways, it kind of matches what activists in the 60s were dealing with, which is, what is your what is your horizon in terms of what you imagine for the future? What is your horizon in terms of what sort of society you can imagine? Because with ideas like Black capitalism, they do in some ways line up with the idea of social capital or social capitalism, trying to pool resources for the betterment of a particular community. On the other hand, activists like Fred Hampton argued, well, actually, Black capitalism can only take us so far. In fact, he had this famous quote where he said, you can't fight fire with fire, you fight fire with water. You can't fight, oh, okay, Daniel has it in the comment section, as a matter of fact. We're going to fight racism, not with racism, but we're going to fight with solidarity. We say we're not going to fight capitalism with Black capitalism, we're going to fight it with socialism. So again, I think with this question of how far free market economics and free market principles can take us is a very important one, because for a lot of activists in 2020, and this isn't their fault, it's simply the world they live in, their imaginations, their political and economic horizons are determined by the framework in which they've grown up and lived in. And we talked about this a lot last week. If you're used to a system that honors corporations, that privileges corporations, that privileges a certain form of democracy that does not take into account economic conditions, then you may have a difficult time imagining a different alternative. And I think that's what we're seeing now is people are, as Brett mentioned, as others have mentioned, since we're confronting now both the problem of police brutality and the larger problem of racism in American society on the one hand, and this pandemic on the other, people are beginning to realize, well, the system as it's currently built just can't handle these pressures like we all assumed it could. Take, for instance, the COVID-19 pandemic. Capitalism in America was rolling along just fine. And then suddenly we had a pandemic. Next thing you know, we have massive shortages of a variety of essential supplies. And then you bring with that the fact that people were having a difficult time getting face masks, getting actual COVID-19 exams to be done. But then in the last 2 weeks, these same locales have had no difficulty at all in rallying their police forces to be used against the American people. So again, free market principles, how much do they allow for this wiggle room that we're talking about to make significant amounts of change? So I see John is raising his hand, Lewis is raising his hand. John, you want to go ahead and go first?
Yeah, sorry, Lewis. I was just going to quick chime in and hearing this discussion, thinking about Derek Bell's interest convergence theory. I know this was a tenet of critical race theory. I think it can help us think about what we see in terms of capitalism today. So, for instance, I see Reebok cut off ties with, I forget who it was, but it was for racist tweets over George Floyd. I think it was
CrossFit, the guy who runs CrossFit.
There we go. We see certain, I think, corporations or, you know, the outreach of capitalism given the certain demands or concessions that on the surface appear to be in solidarity, right? But that's not touching the actual corrupt core that infects all of society. It's a sort of the very shallow giving in at the moment when the country is very, very agitated in order to preserve itself. And I fear at this moment that those on the ground or those who are being introduced for the first time to some of these ideas of police brutality and systemic inequity and racism see this as the system changing. So here again, I think the Modjeska Simkins School and other education programs that remind us of the past is to say, hey, we're not changing anything. We may be changing a few pieces out, but the game is essentially the same. So I fear that that's what we see, but I also fear a lot of, especially white professionals and those who appear to be liberal and progressive, right, seem to be buying into this. But if we keep allowing this history to be erased, we'll fall for this every single time.
Okay, and I saw, well, first of all, Dr. Shaw has joined us this evening. You haven't missed a whole lot. All we've done is discuss capitalism and democracy, very small topics. But yeah, but we're actually, if you look, and I want to go to Lewis because he had his hand up a moment ago too, but if you look in the chat, we have some questions that Brett laid out for us this evening And we're still in the first one about the free market economy. Can it set budget priorities that can pivot to popular demands? We're still discussing that. But Louis, I saw you had your hand up too.
Yeah.
Go ahead, please.
Great, thank you. I guess I'll start with saying there is no such thing as a free market. That's part of the rhetoric. It's always been pretty much rigged. Obviously, since neoliberalism and other things, it's totally fixed. We have, capitalism for profits, but socialism for losses. A lot could be said about that. And inherent in the word capitalism is capital, ownership, labor, work. And human beings as labor is a commodity. So it just, nobody's arguing contrary to what I'm saying, but that's inherently exploitative. The surplus labor value in paying barely a living wage if only forced to. And then there's the drive, the inherent concept in capitalism of accumulation and then growth. So it just seems literally impossible how they pulled off this. Well, it's because they own the means of production, they own the means of culture, they own the media, they own the politicians, and you've had these people that have tried to conflate democracy and capitalism. And I think the present moment really shows that none of that works. We've got a movement since 2011 and 12, Occupy Wall Street, is working for 1/10 of 1%. It's just not really going to go anywhere. And it was even a number of towering figures. Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis said you can have a society with extreme end of wealth on one side, or you can have a society with democracy, but they are mutually exclusive. And I think that's an important point. And I guess let me inject, I wanted to say this earlier. As we take this detailed knowledge, and I think it's very valuable, that how do we also jive that with, we need a united front, I think, as Brett was hinting at, we need to be broad in order to fight fascism. How do we reunite the most people? And when we also recognize that, I bet I'm seeing it seems like we have 24 participants on this call. I bet we've got 24 different lines of understanding if we begin to break it down too much. How do we avoid sectarian splits and divisions and alienations, yet not devolve down to pablum and the lowest common denominator? How do we as organizers and activists formulate an analysis that we can share that is broad enough, I would say that's patriotic enough, because those core values that are in there of freedom and liberty and equality should work for most people. How do we remind people that why in the world is it that our society, a newspaper will say a left-leaning organization, which means maybe that it's anti-racist or it believes more in equality. Liberty and equality are supposed to be the core, not the fringe. And how do we use all of this knowledge to develop? And I think you all in South Carolina, Progressive Network, have a wonderful example of inside out. Here's all this discussion about revolution and capitalism, and yet you've got an inside game with elected officials. So sorry I went on, but I guess I emptied out most of what I wanted to say. Thank you.
No, those are great points, Louis, and I want to really get back to those and expand on them in just a moment, because I think they also tie very well to some of the other questions we want to discuss this evening too. Julia, I see your virtual hand is up right now, so please go right ahead.
Yeah, something coming up for me with the question. I don't remember the exact phrasing of your question, but it was remembering, what I've been taught around those groups fighting for Black freedom and fighting against white supremacy that have been most successful at subverting in some way the free market system. And so one of the examples that I was taught and that just came up for me was the Black Panther Free Breakfast program. And, to me, and also, just to remember that J. Edgar Hoover said, and I encourage people to Google the quote, that that the Panthers were the most serious threat to the internal security of the country. I just looked it up again, because of the free breakfast program, which, to make a really long story short, there's a reason why public schools in the United States have a free breakfast program. It was essentially stolen from the Black Panther Party. In my understanding of it, but this is as much a comment as it is a question too, to check my understanding, that part of the way free market capitalism works is to create dependency. Consumers, of course, like the dependency of Black people on, and all people in different ways, but it is particularly, an assault on Black Americans. So, when the Panthers then refuse to participate and to be dependent economically on the state and on capitalism, that to me is why the FBI and other groups felt so threatened by that, and so violently did everything they could, from COINTELPRO to busting in doors and across the country, to murder the leaders and imprison them and everything. So again, to just circle back, I think these instances, and I'm wondering like where else they are in American history, of ways that groups have subverted the free market economy, give us lessons that we can use now in organizing, to actually get real change.
Yeah, that's another great question there. And I can think of one example off the top of my head, because I think it does come back to the question posed earlier about the free market system and does it allow for the kind of change we actually need. When you pose your question about other groups, other moments in American history where this has actually been attempted or at least tried, I quickly thought of South Carolina in the 1860s, and specifically with two things. With first the Port Royal experiment in 1861, and then by the end of the decade, the attempt at creating a land commission in South Carolina, which would redistribute land from former slave owners to let it be leased by Black and white South Carolinians alike. The thing is that when we talk about the free market system, we talk about economics in general, it is very difficult to separate in African American history the idea of freedom from the idea of political freedom from economic freedom. And this is also true, of course, of American history. But there is a reason why so many activists in the African American freedom tradition often talk about the redistribution of wealth in some form or fashion, whether it's Martin Luther King and democratic capitalism, or socialism, excuse me, or Du Bois and his leans toward socialism and communism later on in his life, or even people like Frederick Douglass, who were supporting some form of land redistribution. They recognize the need for people to be economically independent if they also want to be politically independent too. And I think what we're talking about this evening is that the free market system, as Julia so simply pointed out, doesn't really allow for that independence. Because if it does, then it wouldn't actually work the way people think it's supposed to work. And so I think trying to couple together examples of that, and you think about the fact that all these examples, the Land Commission, Port Royal experiment, the Black Panther Party in the late 60s, early 70s, other attempts at, especially on a grassroots level, of trying to pull resources for these reasons, they are often seen as significant threats to state and national governments. Because again, they offer alternative visions of a good, decent, wholesome life that, if followed through on a national level, could present a serious threat to so-called free market capitalism.
And I would add to Julia's discussion about the Panthers and the breakfast program. I'm a little rusty on this title, but it's the work of Alondra Nelson, who also talks about the Panthers and their clinic program, and the ways in which both the medical and free breakfast programs were sort of the radical pragmatism of the Black Panther Party that argue, you know, if we're going to have this, I mean, and the party was evolving in various aspects of its ideology, and it had different segments of ideology across the Black Panther Party, even though they had a 10-point program to combine them. Some were more cultural nationalists, some more revolutionary nationalists, and certainly Huey Newton, among others, was sort of going more in the sort of even beyond sort of a communist framework in his thinking. But Nelson sort of talks about this, and there's various other individuals, Charles Jones being among them, that talks about the political ideology of the Black Panther Party, that there was this conception of, we won't put a Band-Aid on capitalism, but what we will do is meet the needs of the people. In order to build a revolutionary united front, we must, you know, given that free market capitalism has failed the people, we as the party will meet the people's needs where they are. It's also very important to note that aspects of the emergence of these programs also had something to do with the emergence is the wrong word, the recognized leadership of African-American women in the Black Panther Party. It's because that that the Panthers were under siege, and some of the leaders, like Huey P. Newton, among others, were directly under attack, in imprisonment, COINTELPRO, et cetera, that African-American women like Erica Huggins, among others, and Elaine Brown, you know, sort of became sort of more central figures in the party. And so it's also sort of an innovation in which women's leadership and creativity were critical to the emergence of aspects of these programs. And so that's an intersection. So I want to get to Lewis's point, is the degree to which we think about these intersections. You know, you see individuals see themselves reflected in a movement, in a united front. If I don't see myself reflected in that front, it is hard, even if you were speaking the right line, it is difficult to say, in fact, that you are meeting, that there's inclusion here. So I would say, if you look at that aspect to the Panthers, I absolutely agree with Robert in the sense that there is this sort of, there is this aspect that's sort of fundamental in thinking through the pragmatic. I don't want to say pragmatic radicalism. That sounds a little contradictory, or I don't want to say it's American pragmatism, et cetera. But ways in which this revolutionary nationalism was a lived experience, and was sort of the Panthers drilling down to make a key difference in some ways. Just to throw this in the mix, and I know that Brett Bursey knows of this work because Bursey, among others, and I think Robert as well, were present we're leading a conference that brought this scholar to USC. But this book by Sekou Franklin, After the Rebellion, sort of Black youth social movement activism in the post-civil rights movement generation, and I'll put it in the chat. I think it's a really good discussion about this question around the activism of Black youth, because we've already talked extensively, and you probably already mentioned this book in this discussion. I would not be surprised, about the Southern Negro Youth Congress. But what I think it also does is it's an excellent discussion of the National Negro Congress in the 1930s, and the way there was this marriage between, as I know we've already talked about some, between communist, socialist, Black and white, as well as sort of A. Philip Randolph's conception of this broad umbrella. And so this goes back to Lewis's point that individuals have been thinking about this united front, as I know we all know, for quite a while. And often it breaks down under points of siege, right? It's sort of the McCarthyism partly of the 1950s, early 1950s, that then pulled the National Negro Congress apart. But what successes, we can study the successes they had, and look at that as examples of how you build this broad-based movement. Again, A. Philip Randolph, among others, providing some insights about that.
That's wonderful. Those are some really good points we need to take into consideration. Avery, I saw you had your hand up for a brief moment. Please go right ahead.
Oh yeah, thanks. My name's Avery, and I don't have much to add to this discussion, seeing as how young I am, but I want to say some things just as a, I guess as a meat to the conversation, as a means to introducing myself. So regarding this question of like liberating ourselves from the market, can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Thanks. It seems to me that any attempt, like with, for instance, the Black Panther like free lunch thing, any attempt to liberate ourselves from the market is extremely like steep and maybe even implausible. But I mean, basically to address the question of, can the market set a budget for the people? Can a free market society, a free market economy address the needs of the people and allow for a shift towards more egalitarian principles? I think this sort of question gives into a false portrayal, a false framework of the contrast between capitalism and socialism. I hear a lot of conservatives say that socialism is like government-controlled market and capitalism is like business owner or the people controlled. It's free market. There's laissez-faire. So essentially, what I'm trying to say is that it's more of a spectrum between capitalism and socialism. There's no such thing as a free market. Yes, the current market is rigged towards the capitalists, towards the robber barons. However, you know, any program, any socialist program like roads or anything like that is something that rigs the market towards the people, so to speak. So essentially what I'm trying to say is that in order to have this market, whatever the market exists right now, in order for it to address the needs of the people, in order for it to move towards socialism on the spectrum, the workers, not the government, but the workers through the government have to assert control over the market, have to slowly constrict it and make it more and more socialistic over time. But the problem is, and this is the Brett Bersey's Kool-Aid talking, we don't have democracy right now. So we have to first reassert democracy and then through those means constrict the market. Yeah, so I think that's how the current market could slowly address if we restore democracy. So I'll leave it off there.
Thanks so much for that, Avery. First of all, anybody participating in tonight's conversation, no matter how young or old you all have valuable ideas and valuable perspectives to bring to the table. And Avery, you make some really good points that I think we're going to come back to before the night's over for sure. And I see, and the second you mentioned socialism, I knew Daniel's going to pop in. I see that instead of the bat signal, we have the hammer and sickle signal going out. So Daniel, I see you had your hand raised. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, so first I want to say I'm really glad Avery is with us tonight with the network and also joined our little critical reading group. And so, yeah, just want to address this thought of this spectrum that Avery referred to. And I think he's correct. I just want to make a few caveats. So oftentimes liberals and conservatives will conflate socialism with an administrative state or a welfare state. And so actually, and this we can argue this later, this is the utopian impulse of Marx. What proletarian socialism is referring to is the reconciliation of the civil and the political. It is the withering away of the state, where each works according to their ability and each acquires according to their need. And so this sounds like, you know, something we're so far away from. But in terms of like becoming the state, becoming merged, let's say, with worker control, this is called a preponderance of working class power. And this is the necessary transitional step to socialism. Now, this is a very scary word or a scary phrase, but the dictatorship of the proletariat. All this means is that the working class is in power as opposed to who's in power now? Billionaires. We're the dictatorship of capital currently. And so I completely concur with Avery that there's going to have to be a transition of the market. Workers are going to have to capture the market, to constrain it, and then possibly, maybe this is implausible, as Avery said, but you know, what's the quote that revolutions are always called impossible and then they happen and they're called inevitable. But just, I really want to clear up this notion of socialism being the welfare state or the administrative state. I mean, this is something I agree with Milton Friedman, you know, building dependence upon capitalist politicians, the road to serfdom, right? And I think it, you know, the welfare state, in a sense, perhaps can. We have to force people to always vote for a certain party so the state can continue to administer to us, as opposed to there being a reconciliation that civil society one day will be able to govern itself and abolish the state. And again, that's a question. Maybe that's implausible, but socialism has nothing to do with a state or a country. Socialism is precisely this reconciliation, the withering away of the state and humanity becoming reconciled with itself and meeting basic human requirements, as opposed to a state or a market administering it. And will that ever be achieved? I don't know, but why don't you help me find out?
Now, see, what I like about this class being recorded is we now have a recording of Daniel Dewey saying he agreed with Milton Friedman about something. So we will never forget that. But I see Todd is about to add a comment, and I do think this is as perfect a time for us as any, because I think we're already getting to the second question of, is a peaceful transition of the U.S. and South Carolina government to egalitarian principles possible? I think we're already on that question now, because we're raising these issues about capitalism and democracy and how compatible or incompatible they are. But Todd, please go right ahead.
Well, just real quickly, I don't want to hog the floor, but Daniel's insights reminded me of something that I teach a course on Black political thought, and we were on a segment on African American Marxist and socialist thought. And I remember I showed the students a segment from the thinking of Stokely Carmichael or Kwame Ture, who as you know of his importance in legend in the Black Power and the revolutionary nationalism movement. And Ture was posed a question. He had founded the All-African People's Revolutionary Party, and he was asked a question because he was a Pan-African socialist, and he had asked a question. He was asked a question about, well, individuals critique. So this is to Daniel's notion of the administrative state, but also sort of the state even more broadly. He was asked a question about, well, hasn't the socialist or communist experiment failed? If you look at Russia, you look at communist China, and so the sort of dictatorial impulses in those states. So hasn't it failed and been disproven? And he says, well, you're judging socialism or communism, according to the outcomes of these particular historical experiments. And he says, okay, so you're not judging it according to the ideal state. You're not judging it according to the ideals or principles. He says, you don't judge Christianity based upon the actions of churches. You don't judge Christianity based on what in fact we find in quote unquote Christian America. You judge it according to the ideal. And so my students kind of smiled and chuckled a bit about that, but found that an interesting principle, that it's the ideal that we use as the standard, not the how far have we gotten thus far.
Okay, and Avery, I saw you were about to say something as well. Please go right ahead.
Oh no, I was waving to my neighbor. Thank you.
Oh, okay. All right, so Rick, please go on.
Yes, I'm back. I was trying to unmute, but along the continuum, whether there's a continuum or two different, ends to that continuum, there's many pathways to socialism, and Marx didn't set out how to get there. He just had an ideal of how to get there. Even within the current framework, even within the political constraints that exist now, there are ways to deal with the market. There are, it's worker empowerment. Worker-owned factories, worker-run factories, cooperatives. Those fit in to the market economy, but if without a profit motive, they operated at a different level. So as Daniel was saying, gaining the power to the workers. Well, the workers can do that to some extent at their own level. It's small, but there are possibilities. And Dr. Wolf at Amherst has a lot to say about that. He's an advocate of, I forget what he calls them, self-directed establishments, whatever. But within the immediate, it doesn't have to work within the framework of overthrow the government. You know, there is economic power that can be gained without gaining control of the state.
You know, again, these are some really good points for bringing up this evening. And what I want to do now is, because I think Cecil has made some good points in the chat too. Cecil, do you want to elaborate on those a little bit for us?
You can read the comment. Yeah, you can read the comments for yourself. I took the question literally, and it asks, is the free market economy able to pivot to address these current popular demands? I took that to mean, you know, the needs of meeting the COVID crisis, the pandemic, addressing the protests, et cetera, et cetera. And you see my answer there is no, I don't think that a free market economy in which private enterprise rests upon a profit motive has the capacity to turn on a dime and meet the needs of the people instantly. I think that a strong federal government can do that, and it has demonstrated that it can do that. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why I think a strong federal government is necessary. And in fact, it says in the the preamble to the Constitution, one of the clauses there is to promote the general welfare. This is one of the very reasons that we have a strong federal government is to promote the general welfare in times of crisis and catastrophe like this. I used the examples of James Lee Witt, who was Clinton's FEMA administrator, who came in and reformed FEMA back in the 1990s and turned it into a well-oiled machine. And that was, of course, replaced for purposes of comparison and contrast with Michael Brown under the W administration, and failed miserably, which illustrates that not only do you need a strong federal government, but also a Congress and a president that also believes in the responsibility of a strong federal government to prepare, to preempt catastrophe, and to be ready for it. In an email I sent to Brett before tonight's call, I said 3 models already exist that illustrate these points. One is that the federal government maintains a massive national network of military installations that can serve as emergency management outposts if needed. The second is that the federal government maintains a strategic petroleum reserve through which it purchases at immense profit to the private sector, and it stores billions of barrels of petroleum products for use during economic emergencies. So this demonstrates that it can be done when a strong federal government chooses to do it. The third model is that the U.S. Treasury Department has proven itself a model of efficiency in distributing monthly Social Security benefits checks to millions of Americans, and of course, in distributing federal stimulus funds to taxpayers when the Secretary of the Treasury chooses to exercise his authority to do that. In my opinion, no private industry, and private industry is the bedrock of the free market economy, no private industry would take on any of these functions out of the goodness of their heart. Private industry is not in business to be altruistic, it's in business to make a profit. And so without a guarantee of profit, no private industry would do this. But the federal government's charge, which is different from private industry, is to promote the general welfare and not to make a profit. That point that the federal government is not charged with making a profit is proven in its unreimbursed subsidization of research and development by private corporations in developing new drugs, new prescription drugs. We subsidize that activity to the tune of billions, and when private corporations make hundreds of billions in profits, we don't get to see any of that back again. Those are the points that I made in response to the first question.
Okay, and I think this is now as good a time as any, because I think we're building momentum to question number 2. And keep in mind, we have 3 questions left we want to address before the evening's over with. So I'll take the next 2 and combine them together. Number 1, or rather number 2, is a peaceful transition of the United States and of the state government of South Carolina to egalitarian principles possible And then within that framework, let's also consider this question. What political theory and strategy seems dominant amongst the participants of the protest provoked by George Floyd's murder here in South Carolina? Does it differ from what the media and politicians see as the path to solutions? So let's think about those two. Like, how do you get to a place where an actual egalitarian system of government is possible? And can it be done peacefully?
I want to contribute to the segue, Robert, that when we're talking about the free market economy being able to transition, we have to realize that the system is not designed to do that. I mean, there's no constitutional basis for two parties. There's no constitutional basis for the type of money driving the politics we have. If you were practicing politics the way we do here in most countries, you would go to jail. Friday, the former Supreme Court Justice Jean Toll.
I'll be here tonight. Okay. We can work on the pills and start the list. And
somebody needs to mute themselves. But on Friday, the former Supreme Court Justice Jean Toll issued a ruling that didn't even get reported. And it was a minor case of a senatorial candidate in a Republican primary going to federal court for injunctive relief on the Republican Party giving more money than is allowed to a candidate. $5,000 is what the party can give. Toll dismissed the action. She said, no, that's not right. But then she issued an opinion that said that there are no constraints on how much money the party can give, or a committee can give to a candidate. So we just opened the floodgates for November. There are no constraints on the amount of money. We had a $50,000 limit on what the party could give on paper since '91, 5,000 to senatorial candidates and 1,000 to House candidates. But that the money driving the train is not going to go away. They're not going to go down easy. They're smarter than some of the politicians.
Sounds like
but I think that what we're seeing in the question of can they pivot, it's that they can pivot, but will they turn loose of power? And that we're seeing that this rush to the COVID vaccine, essentially they're going to try and keep control of the copyrights of it. But the next question that we're transitioning to is the peaceful transition possible. And that what we've seen historically over and over again, if you paid attention to the Modjeska School, is that if you get effective, they're going to come after you. And they're going to try and do different things, and they'll all kind of different tricks they have. But we haven't seen this particular insurrection have any sense of real analysis that threatened the man. I mean, Trump called out the U.S. Army, obviously preemptively just to strut his stuff. But what is it that we would do that would bring about their force? And that would be being effective. That's what got the Panthers killed. They were effective. That's what got the Southern Negro Youth Congress smashed by the Red Scare. They were effective. And so the whole question of that speaks to the broad-based united front with many different heads, that if you chop a head off, the creature keeps living. And that's the strength of the united front, and that the fact that we have to have all our cards on top of the table. The people that want to retain power will blame it hands down on outside agitators and the other changes from time to time. It's either it was the communists for a long time, and now it's the immigrants, and it's the outside agitator. And so that we need to be eternally vigilant and pushing new people up to be leaders and keeping that base broad, so that they can't pin it on Kwame Ture or Huey Newton or Louis Pitts. And so I wanted to perhaps shorten some of that discussion on the peaceful transition. But if we can conclude that they will get as mean as they need to. Remember now, folks, these are the people that have a military presence in 130 countries in the world. We spend more money on weapons of destruction than the rest of the world combined. And you and I would vote to trade at least one Trident nuclear missile for healthcare. And so that the money is driving the train, and that speaks to the level of force that they will use to maintain that. Fitz.
Yes, I agree with Brett's point. I think we do have an example last week where some of the military basically did this to Trump. I mean, he was wanting to call for a palace coup, and they kind of, so I think how much we have generated through the morality and the moral authority that we generate as we build the united front, it lessens their power. It doesn't mean there won't be a handful of people that would go along with Trump and do the shooting. But as has been said, there's nothing in our system that's set up to deal with this sort of radical change, but it can and will happen. Look at just the last week. I mean, it's taken, I hate to use the word riot, it's taken property destruction and disruption, but underpinned with the moral authority. Some of you, I'm sure, will know better. There's a African-American woman, I think she's written a book with 2 other people, seem like the first name is Kimberly, and I just saw a 2-minute clip. She's outside. She is raising hell, and she says, y'all broke the social contract. If you've seen, she makes a powerful argument. There's a social contract. When somebody steals from somebody, the system says the system will come in and fix it. The people y'all send in to fix it, kill us. That's not working. And she says, I don't give a F about your Target, your Football Hall of Fame. Burn it all down, because when we rebuilt our wealth in Tulsa, you bombed us. When we rebuilt our wealth in Rosewood, and she could have gone on and went through that, you destroy it. So we don't care, and then you folks better be happy that Black folks are just asking for equality and not revenge. And it's very powerful. And that notion, I think that's why the Reverend Barber Poor People's Campaign has a lot of horsepower. It's very militant, and militant doesn't have to be blowing things up. Somebody's going to do that anyway, just because people thank you for that name, Julie. So anyway, I think that's what I think.
Professor, where did you see Ms. Jones on television?
Pardon?
Where did you see her give this interview?
A friend of mine sent me a clip through a text, which is hard for me to then forward, and maybe Julie just sent who that was. Did you, Julie? Kimberly Latrice Jones.
I'll look it up.
Yes.
Thank you.
It was powerful.
Avery, please go ahead.
It seems to me, I mean, this is a very unorthodox view that I hold, but also an orthodox Christian view, that fundamentally we all have the same values, like pretty deep down. It's buried under a lot of rhetoric and under a lot of myths that we hold, but I think that on both sides of the aisle, we tend to have the same values. If we can see through the subterfuge that's on like media and whatnot. For instance, my dad and my entire family is a Trump supporter family. And this past Monday, my brother graduated from high school. We argued to no end. I mean, I was shouting and protesting in the car. And it was really vicious and vitriolic, the argument that we had. But I, studied and hunkered down this week and came up so far with four resolutions. I talked about the gerrymandering that Brett's been telling me about, and getting out the vote through the Missing Voter Project, and then a couple of just the common sense police regulations that people are talking about passing. And I know Brett was telling me that maybe this isn't the road to go, but simple things like ending chokeholds and forcing through legislation shooting to be a last resort. And the neighbor that I was waving to a minute ago, her name's Cindy, she's a public defender from Pittsburgh. She told me what they have up there is a special unit, special crimes unit in the solicitor's office for Pittsburgh County that reviews police crime cases and prosecutes them. And they get their reports from the Citizens Police Review Board, to which the police are required to report all uses of force to. So these are like really simple resolutions that I ran past my racist, Trump-supporting grandma and dad, and they were both 100% for it. They were like, that's common sense. So while we may not agree on all the facts of the current political situation and circumstances, especially the racially tinged ones, they agree on basic policy issues. So I'm really, really drinking Brett's Kool-Aid here, because I really think that if we can find a way to restore democracy, get money out of it, and get a sensible center in, and get actual representatives of the people in, then I think we can pass sensible resolution and have a rational dialogue. Because I think we all have the same values deep down, even though we say a lot of really nasty things that we don't mean.
Footnote here, Avery, I'll take the blame for making you drink the Kool-Aid, but it's not my recipe. I learned it from other people.
Okay.
So is there anyone tonight who's not yet spoken up? Because I know there are quite a few people who have made some really fascinating arguments and given some really good viewpoints there. But anybody who's not chimed in yet this evening who wants to say something about either the questions we're dealing with right now or with any other questions that we have in the chat.
Yeah, I was just thinking, as you know, I hear different questions and comments, whatever. In what way can we further the use of technology to further the aims of this group and the goals that they intend to achieve? So it may seem a little simplistic, but that's what's going on through my mind right now. Because there's a lot of, political theory and stuff that's going back and forth across the table. And I can appreciate that. I'm learning a few things. But that's the part that really, a lot of this stuff is humanity deja vu over and over again. And although I can appreciate the theory part of it and a lot of the discussion, what sticks up here is using the technology, as technology has been used in recent years quite effectively, to further the aims of this organization. And that's kind of like my basic comment.
No, I think technology is a really important part of what we're talking about this evening, both in terms of how technology can be used to organize people and then how it can be used against folks trying to organize people too. I think back to how, for example, Occupy Wall Street back in 2011 was a movement that was, I think, one of the earliest ones to really utilize social media pretty effectively. But then it also became a liability because what you saw was police officers and other officials were actually tracking down people via Facebook and Twitter, figuring out where they would be, what they were going to do, et cetera. And I think to fast forward to what's going on right now, to your point about technology, I think social media has played a pivotal role in why the protests going right now have been such large-scale protests. Part of it is because people are seeing over and over again in the news, on social media, the death of George Floyd. But then you add to that the fact that so many Americans right now are unemployed. And they not only have the time to go to protests, but they also have time to actually watch the news, to digest what's going on in ways they may not have had before, or only had in limited quantities. So I think your question about technology is really important, and especially when you talk about how do we achieve some of the things that we're talking about on a large, whether city or state level, or looking more broadly at a national level. Because again, in the last 10 years, we have examples of social media being used, for example, during the Arab Spring, right? Don't forget the Arab Spring. I think we've kind of forgotten that even happened because it was 9 years ago and our attention span doesn't go past 4 years. But the Arab Spring, even though most nations in the Arab world didn't turn out the way people wanted it to, that was also a place where technology was used rather extensively.
For sure, and in a way, this is our Arab Spring. This is our inflection point. To make the most of what we have available. And I'm a little, I guess, concerned, and maybe this is a little bit based upon a little bit of naive frustration, perhaps, that the discussion of theory and philosophy and all this is important, but when we march down to the end of this school session, we'll probably be asking that question somewhere along the way. How can we use this current technology and maybe even some projections into next year or whatever, what the new thing is going to be, to further the aims of this group, of this movement? Thank you for your answer.
You're asking me to speak to that, Brent? Getting the Progressive Network to take advantage of the technology has been an ongoing challenge for me. And so I welcome any advice, suggestions that you have. And I would also invite people that are on this forum here to take advantage of the tools that we do have. We have all of our projects are up on the Progressive Network site. There are ways to recruit volunteers for all of those projects. We have a Twitter account, we have a Facebook page and a Facebook group. We're getting ready to launch some Google groups on top of the projects that we're already doing. So there, we've got a YouTube channel that's got a lot of really interesting videos and resources on it, including the recordings of this session that we've made public as a gift to folks during the pandemic. So we've got the tools out there. It's just a matter of all of us taking advantage of them and encouraging the people in our networks to take advantage of them. And I don't know what else to suggest than that.
Avery, let me add to what Becky said, Wes. That we've been suffering from a lack of capacity that's directly related to a lack of money, that's directly related to a lack of our ability to get the word out. It's like a circular firing squad. And that we started the Modjeska School for the express purpose of dealing with those things in Columbia, with the notion that someday, Lord, we want to go statewide with it, do distance learning. Thank you, pandemic. And so there's no reason that we don't start doing so the Modjeska classes and the skill classes and getting outside of Columbia. We can't trust the educational system. We can't trust the media to remind people we've been here before. The fact that the things that I know by getting out of America or reading or being educated, that people are seeing now in real life because of the pandemic. The wealthy people that control the country can't control the pandemic. And the fact is that people are now understanding that, wow, it's sovereign wealth we've got. You mean you can just keep printing money? And Krugman is a brilliant economist. He gives me the heebie-jeebies sometimes. He's a liberal nature, but Professor Krugman, who's a Nobel economist, has been saying for years and years and years, it's not the deficit, it's like inflation, and you can manage that. And they managed to spend billions, trillions of dollars on things they like. Now they're throwing money at keeping people employed. Looking at all over Europe, where actually the unemployment has not gone down because they're actually just paying workers. We have this sieve. We don't give people health care. We pay for insurance, and so that people are seeing, well, gee, maybe we could have sick leave. Maybe we could have a 3-day work week. Maybe we don't have to all report to a cubicle. And so there's things that this pandemic, this global pandemic, those opportunities are going to change some of the reality that we can talk about. But when people realize, y'all can be gentler and kinder because we can do this, that it's creating a broader base that's going to be harder to put back the toothpaste back in the tube when this is over with.
Yeah, I just want to clear something
Sure.
up. Maybe if I said something, not quite right, or if I sounded that way, that I'm not suggesting that this effort has not utilized technology. I think this is the Modjeska School is a very solid step ahead. And I wasn't suggesting that this is not utilizing technology, but what I was musing over was with the goals that this group wants to achieve. Let's say with the redistricting and the gerrymandering and etc. And one of the big things that's on my mind is the Electoral College. Remember, Hillary won by 3 million votes. Let's keep that in mind. And it's very possible, that Donald Trump could win again. It's very possible. So unlike, well, I mean, I may be talking a bit out of turn here, that we have to understand this is a republic. It's not a pure democracy. It is a republic, and a democratic republic. So let's, understand that Donald Trump could win again, and we'd be in a worse shape than and another Donald Trump could win in 24. So, this is getting intense. As Jim Clyburn said, this is an inflection point in our history, an inflection point. So I certainly applaud what this group is doing with the Modjeska School. And I'm wondering too, Brett, what is the what are other states doing? I mean, is there a Modjeska School in North Carolina, Tennessee? I mean, are there other incidents of this kind of a group in other states?
No, because we have to make whatever our tactics and our strategies fit where our feet touch the ground. And so, no, there's nothing quite like it, because our feet touch the ground and what everybody considers their place to be unique. And so this kind of ethnocentrism about our strategy and tactics is on the one part a bit romantic, but on the other part, it's as simple as like, you got to know how to speak the language. You got to know who made the rules. You got to know who benefits from them. And Wes, I feel your pain and I live your pain, because one of our theories is we can't change DC till we change SC. That's driven by that concept that states are the laboratory for democracy. I've been involved in national movements, national radical overthrow the government movements and regional movements and all this stuff, and all of them end with go home and do the work. So I went home to do the work a long time ago, and that we lead by example. And I have felt for a long time, whether as I stayed here, is that the more repressed South Carolina is, it's like a spring that's been pushed down. We could have more profound radical change here than they could in a more liberal place where the masters are more benevolent because they're smarter. We got a bunch of stupid masters here, and that these are dynamics that are working in our favor. I just think we just have to stay alive long enough to get another generation to pick up the torch and retain the principled integrity that I learned from the people that came before me. There's some wonderful people that did things because they needed to be done. And like Modjeska, one of the most wonderful things she's ever said is at the end of tail end of her life, she's like an 80-year-old woman, and people are asking her, Ms. Simkins, how do you keep doing this stuff over and over again? And she thought for a minute, she said, well, I guess I'm just selfish because it makes me feel good. And so it's that sense that it's me that I'm liberating that keeps my shoulder to the wheel. And if we can build a movement, that beloved community that Dr. King talked about, that shares a value that resonates with people, that makes them feel better, we're going to try and feed you, we're going to try and get you health care. But in the meantime, let's organize and fight back against these people, this cruel, evil people they're just denying everything we learned in Sunday school and everything that we learned about America. And so I think the ones that are back, the more crazy they are, the more, the more it wakes people up where they actually experience what we've been talking about. And that experience is better than hearing all of us talking when it affects people's lives.
For sure.
And so I'm like not real optimistic. I'm going to get to the top of the mountain and see the other side. But I think that we've got a responsibility to keep that struggle up.
For sure. And I take all the point that you made, seriously. I would just suggest that there are some similarities, let's say, between North Carolina and South Carolina, Georgia, or wherever, that are going to be, common to all of us in terms of what we want to achieve, even as much as our states may differ.
Let me respond, and I'm going to quit talking here for a while. Yes, there are. And some of the things that I've learned most from North Carolina and South and Georgia are things that we need to avoid, because we're behind them in terms of organizing capacity and et cetera. They fall into whole sectarian holes. They fall into sectarian holes that we're blessed with not having, because there's nobody here to fight with us. And that we're learning about how to relate to the oppression that we share in a different way because of the way it's presented to us. There are anti-unionists. We just went to the 50th, okay? Now, we can go to, there are differences in the different states. A, for instance, would be in Georgia and North Carolina, they don't have a different board of trustees for every institution of higher learning. In South Carolina, because of the way our Constitution is set up for patronage through the senators to begin with, now it's through the legislature, we have 17 boards of trustees that don't cooperate, they compete with each other. In Georgia and North Carolina, it costs half as much to go to college, they're twice as smart as we are, and they have one board of regents that govern the higher education. So there's things like that that we learn from the other states, that they're doing better than we are, and we can make those changes better than waiting on the stuff what they see to happen. I don't have time to deal with DC. They would love us to march on DC all the time and protest. But if we stay home, use the examples where people are actually figuring out ways to get around the ridiculous stuff they're ripping us off with, then we can be more of the threat that we need to be.
Can I ask something of I know there are a couple people on this call that were actually at the protests in Columbia, and I'd be curious to know if they could just briefly tell us what that experience was like, and whether they feel like the message the media is putting out about those protests, if it's accurate, and also how the network could be allies and help harness that energy that's being generated there. Is Julia still with us, or Pat, Daniel, or Avery?
I'm here. I can give a word. Yeah,
please go right ahead.
So I've been, I think, at 3 or 4 protests now, and the experience, the first protest Saturday, once I got to the police station, it is true, you probably heard from Leon Law and on the news, it immediately devolved into like throwing water bottles, and it basically, a lot of people took it as a, I don't know, an opportunity to express violence towards the police that's pent up with immunity. They burned the flag and everything, and it was kind of, it had a violent energy to it, which is totally understandable, and yeah. But going forward, every single protest has been, by and large, extremely peaceful, adamantly so, and all the leaders are adamant about that. And the media has continuously talked about like the Boogaloo people, and they're like not even really there. And I mean, it's just completely peaceful. And I think the media has represented, the local media in Columbia has misrepresented just how peaceful it is. And they've talked about violence, they've talked about Boogaloos, but they haven't talked about how many people are there and what the people are saying and how adamant they are about being peaceful, which is extremely honorable because these people don't really know a lot. They're inventing this peaceful strategy, I think, on their own for the most part. But I will say that they have absolutely no idea what they're doing, and they have absolutely no plan, and that's why they keep meeting every single day. I was just there right before I got to this call. They yell, and they want the state representatives to change. They handed that list of poorly crafted demands. Nobody is communicating. I'm on the leadership Slack that's organizing every single protest. There's like 60 organizers, and they have no plan. They just organize the protest. And to me, I think this is fantastic. And the fact that there are 60 people, like one of them that I'm closest with is a grad student. and she is, I mean, she's a grad student. She's doing grad school work right now, yet she's showing up at the protest. And what that shows is that a lot of these people are ready for change, and a lot of these people are willing to commit time, and a lot of them are on unemployment, quite honestly, and have time to spare. They want to help. They don't know where to go. They don't know how, and they're new to local politics. And we, you guys, SC ProNet, should step in, take everybody that's here under your wing and say, we've been here for a long time. We know what we're doing. We have the resources, we have the infrastructure, we have ongoing projects. We can give you, you know, we can give you the opportunity to volunteer your time in a way that will actually make a difference.
I would agree and disagree with different points, Avery. And, you know, before I say what I'm going to say, because I definitely want to be clear, it's always my intent to be clear but not cruel. So, you know, I appreciate your story, because in my household, we also have, there is no taboo subject. I'm an only child, and so we talk and argue with each other about everything. But at the root of that argument is, you know, not cancel culture is what I mean to say. But I was at the Saturday protest and also a very small part of the Sunday protest. And what my experience of the Saturday protest was that there were a lot of different people from a lot of different groups there for different reasons. Some of them aligned. You know, I would say, with the exception of the white supremacist infiltrators like the Boogaloo Boys, which there is, you know, it's not just a conspiracy theory that they have been involved. You know, there's evidence that there were some Boogaloo Boys there not to support the ending of white supremacy or police brutality, but actually to create a situation that disrupted that and interrupted any sort of you know, constructive, I guess you could say, outcome of the protest. So, you know, that is my own opinion of what I saw. Some individuals who were not affiliated with any, you know, group, some that were, and I think with the exception of the infiltrators, in my humble opinion, the two things that everybody there, regardless of how, you know, all of these various laws and policies, the differences in how they impact us and the differences in our levels of privilege and everything, if we were to poll and say what are the you know, things that we can all agree on, it's an end to white supremacy and end to police brutality in terms of those people who were there, okay, at the protests. I think that the way the media narrative has hijacked and deflected and distracted is complicated, and I don't know if I can say briefly everything that's on my heart to say about it, but I will say that, you know, some of the most troubling things that I saw were, first of all, the vast majority of the protesters that were arrested that I saw were Black American. And, you know, I personally actually witnessed a very brutal takedown of a Black woman and then her son who tried to intervene. You know, when at least one police officer slammed her to the ground. And there's video evidence of this. There's, you know, pictures of this. And so in terms of your points, Avery, about like the organization of that protest, and this is also points that I've heard made by other organizers, you know, because it seems like there was, and I came in on the late end. I came in, you know, 5:30, so I didn't see, you know, everything that happened at the State House. But there wasn't, I don't think, some training and some guidelines set about how we were all going to move. And so what ended up happening is that some of the worst racial and class dynamics played out in the protest, in the sense that who ended up suffering the most in terms of bodily harm, and now the court fines and fees and, you know, impact to reputation and everything. It wasn't so much white protesters, it was Black protesters. I mean, those are the majority of who was arrested and all of this stuff. And I think had those of us who are white, had we been organized, had there been like a greater planning, I guess, of this effort, we would have all been organized around, you know, different strategies of actually like locking arms and intervening when police come in. I mean, that's just like one example. And I don't know if I would ask and the other thing that I would challenge, even though I guess the organizers maybe of Saturday, like we can certainly, I don't like to be an armchair quarterback, so I'm like very hesitant to like criticize, you know. At the same time, I would really watch language, like nobody knows what they were doing. I think there were, you know, maybe the lead organizers of that, you know, of the Saturday march, you know, there's a big learning curve and you know, maybe other things. But in terms of like, were there actual organizers there who weren't the lead organizers of that march, who do know what they're doing, who are, you know, Black organizers who are not part of the Progressive Network, who should also be, you know, be like a part of any of these discussions? Yes. To an earlier point, and then I'll stop, and I apologize if I'm getting rambly, but one thing that, and unclear, to Lewis's point, I don't think that differences need be divisions, but I think that one of the ways that divide and conquer plays out over and over and over again is what we see now happening, I believe, in Colombia, is a lot of different individuals and different groups are reflecting and organizing, and some of those groups are multiracial, some of those groups are predominantly white, some of those groups are all Black. And what I don't want to see happen is the race and class and all these other dynamics come into actually break apart unity, where the majority white organizations sort of take up the leadership role of the organizing space, if this is making sense. Like, I really think there has to be a lot of reflection about who's getting a lot of the attention and the finances, and who's being proclaimed a leader, and a lot of attention to racial and class dynamics around that. And you know, I'll give one example before I'll stop, but like, you know, there's a new bail fund that is an all Black-led bail fund. And, you know, it's not to discredit the other bail fund, which is run by an organization that is far more multiracial. And I don't think it may be predominantly white, but that other bail fund, I mean, if all the money goes to the to the white organizers is what I'm saying, that's replicating instead of actually addressing, like, social justice spaces are not free of these same ugly dynamics. And so I'm not saying there's not a role for the Progressive Network. I wouldn't be here if I didn't believe that. You know, I'm committed to continuing, you know, but I'm also committed to following the leadership and putting my money and time and listening, and also waiting to decide, you know, where I'm going to act, and to really look to those all Black organizations specifically, because I'm very nervous and concerned and cautious about how these ugly dynamics can also show up in social justice spaces.
There's, I think, a lot to digest there from what both Avery and Julia have said about what they're seeing on the ground here in Colombia at the various protests. Now, I'll be honest, I have not gone to the protests for health reasons, because COVID-19, you know, it's still out there. It actually could kill me, just being honest with you. But I am glad to hear from folks who are at the protests, because what is really important to note, because as a historian, I am an armchair quarterback. That's all we seem to do, I guess. But all joking aside, I think what you're seeing here is the importance of long-term organizing, of having the structures and the systems in place for when something like this happens. And you have a lot of people getting involved in organizing who are new to it or are just getting adjusted to doing it on a day-to-day basis. It's not surprising to me that they've had a difficult time getting their demands together, because again, so much is happening on the ground right now. And I think part of what you're seeing is that there are differences in how organizing is going here in South Carolina versus, say, Minneapolis or New York City or Seattle or other places. In other words, to make a long story short, what you guys are talking about shows that we have a lot of work to do here in terms of not just with this current round of protests, but saying, are we going to be ready for the next round of protests? Can we keep pushing this forward, and can we keep this momentum going? Okay, anybody else want to chime in really quickly?
I'm going to see if I can draw out a local government elected official. But I firstly want to say to Avery, it's your job to tell people that we're doing a great job, not our job. And that one of the things that has been, if you had asked me, what have we done wrong? What do we need to be doing? And it's building the local power. The idea we can't change DC, we're tilting at the windmill of the legislature by trying to do base organizing. We can liberate cities. And we happen to have somebody that is with us, and I don't know whether she's actually hearing me now, it's a county councilor who's actually a very progressive person who has some insight into the opportunities in this town of Columbia and this county of Richland that we're going to talk about in a minute about our Fair Maps meeting tomorrow night. But I'm wondering if we could get that said council person that I don't want to call out to say something.
Hi. Thank you for being so kind. I've been listening along, and I'm actually coupling my Modjeska school time with my yoga practice. So thank you for being the theme for that practice today. It's so interesting. Yes, I did go to the protest starting on Saturday. I felt like it was necessary, and I am an experiential learner. And so I'm the kind of person that needs to see and feel and hear things for myself and kind of be immersed in it and get the visceral feeling, because how else am I going to know how to act after that? And I think that a lot of people, elected folks, think that they can read something in the news or hear something from their friend or watch something on social media and sort of know what that's about and know what's going on. So I really went, and of course I am if you can't tell, a white lady. And so I felt like it was my place to go and not be the center of attention. So there's not any Facebook pictures, selfies of me there, but rather just to go and listen and try to learn. And it's incredibly amazing to see. I mean, what an opportunity that we have to get a vast number of people behind some real ideas. And I'm going to say that I don't really know what those ideas are just yet. Like I'm sort of letting it all sit and stew. And I was there on, was it Friday that they listed all of the demands? What was the day that we were there and Todd Rutherford was there and there was all of the demands got read out. And I think Todd said something to the effect of, is that all? And then that made me think, is he running for governor? So those are my thoughts and feelings right now. I did march over to the police station. I did sort of leave around the time that some water bottles got thrown. I did speak to Sheriff Lott, and I did speak to Wayne there for a moment on the way out. And so all of those conversations have helped me feel like maybe I can start to formulate what looks like next. But it's always interesting to hear your take on, they had a voter registration table up on the last day that I was there. And, I am getting my progressive network education because I was like, oh, they think that's, they think that's the answer, is to register more voters. Yeah, that's my 2 cents right now.
I want to tell you that Allison may be a government official, but she is more importantly an organizer for Planned Parenthood and a member of the Progressive Network. Thank you, Allison.
Thank you.
Yeah, just for a moment, I was going to chime in that I don't think I completely understand the impulse, the necessary impulse to say, what are the concrete demands? What are the concrete outcomes? I heard from members of the Columbia, or I was, listening to the news and hearing members of the Columbia City Council who I know or know very well. And, one response was, well, you didn't, you as the organizers didn't do your homework because we're doing all of that. So there's a part of me that says, yes, those are, and very much to Julia's point, I'm not going to be hypercritical about individuals who are trying to, if good intent, certainly, it's always the question of intent, but if they are trying, even in confusing and blurry ways, trying to move something ahead, right? And so I'm guarded and cautious about that. The whole armchair quarterback principle. But at the same time, I think it's and I take the same from Amilcar Cabral about tell no lies and claim no easy victories. I think we can say that there is some possible shift happening around these broader questions, right? I don't think it's a small thing that at least some of these opinion polls, and I suspect to the Bercy principle, we could see aspects of this in South Carolina, that some of these opinion polls are revealing the fairly, what seems like a consensus in American public, and I know you gotta be careful about the American public, around the justice of the cause, around being more concerned about the issue itself than the quote unquote rioting, around so you're seeing some, even though I was also reading stories about that policing experts and scholars are a bit critical and cynical that there's really going to be real substantive reform. I do take it that this is a moment that might produce aspects of a movement. And some of this, I quite frankly, I've been thinking about, is this a pent up set of progressive energies that have now sort of squarely come to grips with the fact, hell, we're in the middle of a pandemic, the economy is in the tank, and 40 million people are claiming unemployment benefits. What the hell do you have to lose? Sorry to sound like Trump, but this is a what you have to lose moment. And so, and someone who's, at least studies grassroots movements and have tried to be very much a scholar's activist myself, I do know framing and consciousness, for all the reasons we in this networking discussion can say matter, right? And so now it's not the only prerequisite, but the fact that you have individuals unabashedly carrying signs about Black Lives Matter in various ways, who themselves do not self-identify as African American. And so that's a moment that I think is an important shift not to be taken lightly. I'm not saying anything more than folk have already said, and I'm certainly not trying to claim it as a victory myself or claim as a broader victory per se. But there was one aspect that I say, framing and ideals, are fundamental to movements, right? It's sort of it's the tagline of what is the justice of your cause. And I can't breathe being here in South Carolina, a very powerful sort of signature to the movement is important. And that it signals something as an opportunity, a set of political opportunities. Windows of opportunity close, and so the Progressive Network, as it does, will continue to talk about what should we do to do what we've been continuing to do, but now that there's a new set of opportunities, step in with things that are concrete, possibilities of moving us in a more progressive, egalitarian way. But anyway, I'm gonna stop there. I don't want to overtalk my point, but again, I just think that there is something to be claimed, even in this moment, although we know the backlash, the various things are coming. You know, they're already sort of geared up about what defund the police. But at the same time, I think to celebrate that there is something happening that opens up the possibilities of progressive change.
So it's funny because I think, well, okay, I know Brett has one last thing he wants to talk about for our next class, but real quick, Lewis, you have the floor, and go to Brett after that.
Yes. Something that we're seeing here is the opportunism of current leaders. Our mayor, white female, an African-American city councilman, who's horrible. They've both been horrible. They're now pretending, coming out saying, both yesterday in the paper, we hear your arguments, listing Eric Garner and the people, including the mayor, listing the homeless man who was hogtied and killed by our police department 2 years ago. And the city is fighting the civil rights lawsuit. The African-American guy, just horrible. As we talk about United Front, so many of our merely liberal folks are going to fall for those head fakes. And our mission needs to be to help with a very morally based elementary elevator rap, be able to convince them to don't take that head fake and to continue to keep the pressure on and force them either out of office or to make the change that they're sort of only hinting at that they're willing to do. I wonder if y'all have seen that phenomenon yet. Probably don't have time tonight, but.
I want to see if anybody's going to pop if they don't get to say something before I wrap it up and Robert gets to bless us off into the distance. So one of the things I want to bring up is that our inability to be able to grab people and say, look, you missed this, is only moderated in my heart by the fact that I missed it growing up. And that this is a cycle that goes around and around. It's like the demands that came out of the protest in Colombia weren't as strident as the ones that were that came out of the Southern Negro Youth Congress 72 years ago. And it was the same thing. They were talking about jobs, health care, police brutality, and that unfortunately the people that made the demands last Friday didn't know those demands were the same were made. So our job in a large part is kind of connecting those dots so people can understand who the enemy is. And also, I think as importantly as understanding who the enemy is understanding that the enemy of the enemy is your ally, that even if you don't like people, if they're working for the same principle that you are, you can work with them. And that we're going to have to, given the reality, we're going to have to make some concessions that are actually principled. And next lesson, next Monday, is strategy. And so what we've been talking about tonight is looking at how do we take the theory and move it into a strategic way of reaching people and moving the game. And the last class 10, is practice. How do we practice that? We mushed up some stuff tonight, but I want to leave you with the thought about this difficult decision of, there's this thing that the communists call the bourgeois democracy. And that's you give the population enough to keep them happy. And that the worst thing you can do, the absolute worst thing you can do, is create a class of people with nothing to lose. And by damn are they doing that hand over fist. Hand over fist. How do we take advantage of that? Not sound like we're some kind of Stalinist leadership that inherited the torch, but also to be able to bring together that united front, to be able to stay alive and keep the planet here and carry on into a new day. And one of the things I want to just leave you with is that I had the same kind of similar arguments that I'm hearing about. I can't vote for Bernie. What does that mean? You're going to vote for Trump? No, I'm just not going to vote. I had the same kind of discussions late into the night, really heated discussions. I can't remember what year it was that Richard Nixon got elected, about not voting for, who the hell was he running against? Humphrey.
1968 Humphrey.
I can't remember. And that the thing was, is that as a white middle-class male American, I have the privilege of supporting the most strident American running for president, while there are people around the world that we're killing. There are people in the what we called at the time the ghettos, the Black Bantustans in America, that don't have the privilege I have to make that exception that I'm not going to participate with this because I'm smarter than that. That's a fight we're going to have between now and November 3rd with our comrades. That it's not you're indulging yourself by expressing your radical activities by basically giving rein to the right-wing wackos that would bring fascism on. And so that's my closing marks there. You got to study for the strategy class, and I hope you all come back. Tomorrow night is our regular monthly network meeting that we're going to Zoom here at 7 o'clock. And we're going to talk about how do we put this business about redistricting the state of South Carolina, how do we make it happen? And our plan is so complicated, nobody's even understood it. So we're going to do it in Richland County. And we've got a tremendously progressive and enlightened county council here that I haven't talked to any of them that's opposed to it. Of course, I haven't talked to the few Republicans. But we can bring Richland County across the line on a petition drive. The council has to make a statement before the election that says the voters of Richland County, the Republican voters, the independent voters, the Democrats, we all say our legislative delegation has to let us vote to change the Constitution to keep the politicians from drawing safe seats. If we can get that across the line, it'll make big news. And when people go to vote on November 3rd and they realize that, oh my God, there's only one person on my ballot. We get phone calls on the election protection hotline saying, there's something wrong. They've left the Republicans off, or they've left the Democrats off. There's only one person to vote for. And that's like the way it is. And most people don't have it yet. We have to show them. We have to, here's the problem. Here's a solution. Let's practice it. So that's tomorrow night. And next Monday, we'll see you here talking strategy about building the movement, keeping it coherent, moving forward. Robert?
I want to leave everybody with this quote. It's from Horace W.B. Du Bois in 1951. Quote, either in some way or to some degree, we must socialize our economy, restore the New Deal, and inaugurate the welfare state, or we descend into military fascism, which will kill all dreams of democracy, or the abolition of poverty and ignorance, or of peace instead of war. I can't think of a better way to sum up the stakes of what we're talking about tonight when we talk about this entire class. So until next time, have a good one.
Thank you all.
All right. Take care, everyone.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Good night, Allison, Rick, Jacob, Avery, Julia.
Good night. Good night.